In a world where it seems totally normal to listen to a podcast about the Toronto Argonauts, it's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the X's and Argos podcast, brought to you by Funny Bone Broth. My name's Ben Grant, joined as always by JB, and we've got big news for you today. Instead of how it usually works, where we record a podcast and 10 seconds later, breaking news comes out, today's news actually hit the wire before we set to record. So we're in a terrific position here for the first time ever, JB. We signed Macbeth. Now, that may not sound like a huge news story in the context of all the other great signings the Argos have made over the past, well, I guess 2 years. But I think there's actually a lot more to this, and there is some more importance to this signing in particular. What were your initial thoughts when you saw that McLeod Bethel-Thompson was coming back to Toronto?
He's clearly a CFL-capable quarterback, and to have him as a backup is a good idea. My concern would be if they are muddling the depth chart. As long as it's very clear that Arbuckle is the one and Macbeth is two, I think that's fine. I don't want to get into a situation where guys are splitting reps or there's some, ambiguity as to who's in charge. I think it's really important to have a clear number one and a clear number two. And as a number two, it's a good signing.
You obviously can't come into this signing treating it as though McLeod Bethel-Thompson is in a fully open competition with Nick Arbuckle. It's just not a sensible way to approach it. And I don't think the Argos have approached it that way. I think there's a difference between saying the best guy is going to play and saying there's an open QB competition. Because if you go to Argonauts.ca, Mike Hogan has an article out about the signing, and he had a chance to talk to Bethel-Thompson, but also to Murph and to Coach Dinwiddie. And so seeing those different perspectives is pretty interesting. And while Macbeth says the coaches say the best man will play, I think that's something that occurs always in football. Your best player plays. You don't play the guy that's not the best. I think that's just an accepted thing. I do not think that's the same thing as saying we don't currently have a starter in mind. I think based on what Murphy has said and what Dinwiddie has said, Arbuckle is without question the starter, and Macbeth is there if things go wrong, if there's an injury, if maybe even if it doesn't get off to the start that they envision. I think then they've got a plan B, which is McLeod Bethel-Thompson. I think that's how they have framed it, even though they haven't actually come out and said the exact words.
Well, yeah, I would prefer less ambiguity, and I'm personally just a big fan of, honesty and clarity, and to use coach speak like best guy plays, like that's just not true with a quarterback. You've got your one. Your one is going to get most of the snaps. Your one is the guy that you have tied your wagon to, and the backup is the backup. And I hope that the backup was not told that he will have a chance to compete, because if the backup is competing, then that means you don't have a one. There should be no competition between a one and a backup. It means you have two backups.
But I don't think you ever bring in a free agent quarterback with the war cry of you're never going to play.
Well, I don't think you should. I think that usually you don't have to make that statement. Usually that's implied and understood because the starting quarterback is so dominant that you don't actually have to make that statement. It's just simply understood. In the Argos case, they don't have an established quarterback. And my concern is that they're going to screw that up and try and split reps and see who's, I don't want any of that. I want Arbuckle to get all the reps, and I want him to get all of the support and see if he is something. And I want them to be really upfront about that, and I don't want to see anything even remotely being split reps.
And I think you're going to get all of those things. I think that's exactly what's happening. Everything that you want to see. I think it is a given. Like you're saying, you want it to be. It is a given. Arbuckle is the starter. He's clearly Coach Dinwiddie's guy. The guy they went out and got. The guy that he has worked together before. The guy they let Matt Nichols go because of. He's clearly the guy. And McLeod Bethel-Thompson hasn't been signed by anyone. He was sitting out there as a free agent. And so he's clearly not the number one option. If he were the number one option, then he would have been brought in before. So I don't think they need to come out and say it that way. I don't think they need to actually say, no, just so we're clear, McLeod Bethel-Thompson's here to be the backup.
I know, but I hate any coach who pretends like there's an open competition because the best guy plays. Like, just say it. It's not an open competition. We have our quarterback one. I can't stand that coach talk. It just, to me, is a lie. And or it's not a lie, and we don't have a good quarterback.
I agree, but I don't think that's what Coach Dinwiddie's saying. Like, if you look at, let me read you a quote from Mike Hogan's article.
I want to hear, we have a starting quarterback, and this kid's going to be a good backup. That's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear anything else from the Argos.
I think what Coach Dinwiddie said essentially is that. He says, that's not how I view it. We know there are injuries in this league, so that's why you've got to have two. I feel like those guys will work well together. They're good leaders. They're going to make each other better at the same time. And if you look at what Murph says, to sort of add to that, he says, it gives us options. It gives Nick a reliable veteran to bounce things off of. Mike O'Connor raved all year about McLeod as a leader, as a guy who would work with him, share ideas, take questions. He's not just here to play. He's here to be a part of the bigger picture because he's already a positive part of our culture. So both of those quotes, to me, I don't think it could be much more clear than saying, like, yeah, we know Arbuckle's our guy, and McLeod is the perfect guy to come in as a veteran presence who, if things go sideways, can take over.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue they don't say that. I know you're interpreting that. They could have just said what you just said. There's no reason they couldn't have. But that's fine. I won't lay judgment yet. My back gets up when coaches talk about open competition. Just please God, those words never come out of Dinwiddie's mouth.
They won't. They're not going to say open competition. They're just not. Right. There's just a level of courtesy to this. You just don't bring a guy in, and on the day he signs, we're excited to have McLeod Bethel-Thompson play here for the Argos, but there's no way he's seeing the field sign here.
Yeah, that's what they should say.
No, you can't. Like, you can't.
They shouldn't say we're excited. I'm not excited.
I'm excited.
No, it's like having an extra pair of work gloves. Like, I'm happy that I have them, but I'm not like staying up at night.
But that's not the CFL anymore. You need two legitimate guys. We saw that last year. Winnipeg won the Grey Cup in 2019. If they had had just one guy, there's no chance that was going to happen. Calgary, with their run that they had, needed Nick Arbuckle to step in there and take over for a number of games. If they'd had just one guy in Bo Levi Mitchell, that would have fallen to pieces.
Yeah.
We saw what happened with with teams that don't have more than one quarterback. It doesn't go well.
Yeah. All right. I mean, we'll see. I would say my enthusiasm from anybody from 2019 is low, but I think that he's a fine he's a fine organizational body to have in the mix, and we will move forward.
So let's take a look at what McLeod Bethel-Thompson was when we last saw him, because there were positives and negatives. And I know that I was much higher on his play in 2019 than you were, but I don't think he was perfect by any means. There were problems. And I do think Nick Arbuckle is a better quarterback is the wrong thing to say. I think Nick Arbuckle has a higher ceiling than McLeod Bethel-Thompson. I believe we now know.
I hope so.
No, but McLeod has improved every step of the way. When he came into the league, he didn't look like he did in 2019. Every step he has taken has been an improvement. Even within 2019, running an offense that wasn't at all designed for him. Remember, it was a an offense that was designed for James Franklin that he took over. He didn't even get a full season. It was plays that weren't made for him that Coach Chapdelaine had designed for somebody with entirely different skill sets. And so he came in anyway, and throughout that season saw steady improvement. The early film, when you watch him in 2019, those first few games where he had to take over, he looks lost at times. He's standing back in the pocket, and it looked a lot like what we saw in 2018, where he took too long to figure it out and he was taking sacks. Once you get into late August, there's sort of a flick of the switch, and then you really see it in the last game that we played against Montreal, where he was figuring stuff out so much more quickly. He wasn't taking sacks. He wasn't holding onto the ball too long. And we weren't necessarily making plays. Like, we didn't win that Montreal game I'm talking about, but it wasn't because of him. Remember, the team that they had around him in 2019 was not only meant for him, it was a really bad football team. There weren't pieces there. You think about the numbers that he put up with 4,000 yards passing, leading the CFL in touchdown passes, and look what he did it with. There was not much of a receiving core. The offensive line was different every week. There were pieces everywhere. There wasn't an outstanding running game. We've improved in all three of those areas. The receivers are significantly better. The offensive line is better, and the backfield is better. And so if he could put up those numbers with what he had to work with in 2019, even as the backup, a guy not getting full reps, with one more year experience under his belt, I don't see how he's not a better player than he was then.
Well, I know you love him more than I do. And if he has improved, that's great. I think if we're into him as a backup, that's probably not great, but that's okay. I don't think you can expect your backup to be somebody who's going to take you to a championship. However, it does speak to the Argos' understanding that this is not a rebuilding team. That this is a team that, to be honest, is loaded up for a run. And when you're loaded up for a run, you do need a professional quarterback as your backup. So I think it speaks to the Argos' confidence, I think, and belief in what they have as a Grey Cup contending roster, that they have gone out and found a quarterback who will, keep the cart on the rails.
And like we've said many times throughout this never-ending offseason, if there is
if there is football one day,
no, I wasn't going to say that this time. If there is a concern on the offense, as much as I like him, it's Nick Arbuckle. He's the only one that there are question marks about. There really aren't question marks about this receiving core. We know who they are. We know who their backups are. We know who the third string guys are. And I'm fine sending just about anyone out there. I love the offensive line. I love the running backs they brought in. Nick Arbuckle, I really liked in Calgary, but we just don't have enough experience. And so if there's one piece of the puzzle that may be missing when we go to assemble things, should the season ever begin, it's going to be at quarterback. And so having Macbeth here is crucial. I think it was such an important piece.
I don't know what to make of the quarterback competition idea. You would think, steel sharpens steel, and if you can't beat out the backup, then you probably were not the one anyways. And I think that is a fair idea. But if you look around the league and the NFL as well, I do think there's something to be said for, it's not quite kicker level, but there is a confidence that you need to instill in your quarterback. I do worry a bit about Arbuckle not feeling 100% of the organization behind him. I wonder how this was presented to him, if it was at all. And I do worry a little bit about that, because, you see examples of teams that have, 1A and 1B, and then you don't really have anything. And I do worry a little bit about that. I do worry about how it was presented to him. And does he still feel like he doesn't have somebody looking over his shoulder?
I would like to think, especially in the wake of the Aaron Rodgers controversy that has blown up over the last month, I would really like to think that the Argos reached out to Nick Arbuckle in advance and said, just so you know, we're concerned about the backup quarterback position, and we're going to try and bring in McLeod Bethel-Thompson. And if Nick Arbuckle had a problem with that, and I don't think he would have, because he talks to a guy like Murphy, for example, who can tell him, like, look, reach out to Mike O'Connor, ask what he said about it. And everybody in the league seems to say that McLeod's a guy that you want in your locker room. He's a team first guy. Everything that he says is pro team, pro city, pro CFL. And so a guy like that is the perfect veteran to have behind your up-and-coming star. And I think if it's shown to Arbuckle that way, I don't think there's any way he would have a problem with it. And if he does have a problem with it, then maybe you're asking some different questions. And maybe you don't go ahead with this signing. So I think this is something that he would have known about in advance. I don't think he was going to be blindsided by this. And I think it probably was explained to Arbuckle, you're the guy, but now we also know who your backup is. If there's one area in which I think Arbuckle is going to pull away from Macbeth once we get to camp, it's accuracy. As much as I loved almost everything McLeod Bethel-Thompson can do on the football field, his accuracy was one thing that held him back a little bit. He really, if you look at the starters in 2019, his completion percentage was really only higher than Vernon Adams, and they were pretty close. Everyone else was a step ahead of that in terms of completion percentage. And when you watch the film, it's not that he doesn't get catchable balls to his receivers, it's that they're not in the perfect position. You look at some of the other guys around the league who really do have that accuracy, that completion percentage accuracy. Trevor Harris, if you look at Mike Riley, Cody Fajardo, they're putting the ball in the ideal place for the receiver to catch it. He doesn't have to reach back against his body. He doesn't have to go down low for it or make an awkward high catch over the middle of the field. And it was those throws where McLeod was sometimes off. I love his range. I love his arm strength. And I really have come to appreciate his understanding of what he's looking at, because that's something that changed significantly, like I said. But when you watch Arbuckle's film, his passes are usually on the money, especially the short stuff. And that's something that we really never got to see from McLeod Bethel-Thompson. Now, maybe that will improve, but that's an area that we tend not to see a lot of change in. Usually guys that are accurate as pros were always accurate quarterbacks. Very rarely does someone come along who was just a wild slinger and suddenly turn into an accurate quarterback. It's just not something that we see develop very often. So I think that's going to be where the two of them separate. And we end up saying, look, let's go with we're definitely right with our more accurate guy, the guy we'd planned on being the starter. He's going to be it, Nick Arbuckle. And McLeod Bethel-Thompson, he might be the best backup quarterback in the league. I don't think there's any question that McLeod Bethel-Thompson has matured significantly as a quarterback and as a football player and a teammate. One of my favorite quotes that he gave us just sort of shows exactly where his understanding is at and why he's a guy that Toronto, I think this time, because I don't think it happened last time, I think this time Toronto will embrace him. He said, I'm very excited at the prospect of the CFL being back this year, and I can't wait to continue to pursue my passion in one of the greatest cities in the world. I look forward to playing my role as quarterback by making each and every teammate around me better. I think that is the perfect quote, exactly what you want to hear your backup quarterback saying, exactly what you want to hear the veteran that you're bringing in to mentor Nick Arbuckle saying. And so that's a line to me that tells me he knows what the situation is, and he's just here for the team, and he wants to help bring a Grey Cup to Toronto in whatever role that might be for him. All right, JB, let's move on to our second topic of the day, and it's one that has been driving me crazy for months now. Before we get into this next segment, I just want to be absolutely clear that I have no negative feelings and no doubt with regards to any of the reporting done by 3 Down Nation or any of the other CFL reporters that there are across this country. I don't think there's enough coverage of Canadian football in Canada. I would love to see more. And the last thing I'm going to do is rip the people that are actually covering this. And I think Three Down does an amazing job. And I love the work of all the reporters that cover the CFL daily. So that's not my intention in opening up this next bit. That said, I do have some issues with some of the stories that are coming out with regards to the Toronto Argonauts not wanting to play in 2021. I don't believe there's truth to that story. I believe there are sources who are saying that. I fully believe the information reporters are getting are in line with those stories. But it is the sources that I'm questioning, not the validity of the sources, but the content that those sources have, and maybe the agendas that those sources carry with them. We continue to hear, especially from the West, but it started to happen pretty much everywhere now, this idea that the Toronto Argonauts aren't interested in playing in 2021. And what bothers me is that I'm hearing it come from credible guys that I really like as reporters. For example, Justin Dunk, who I have so much respect for. He covers the league brilliantly. He knows things are going to happen before they happen. He has incredible sources. And he's on the Rod Peterson show talking about how Toronto doesn't want to play this year. It concerns me because I know the level of credibility he carries with him. And yet I don't believe this is true. And I don't think there's any evidence to show how this can be true. So how are we in this situation? How can it be that we have credible reporters with good sources breaking stories like this?
It doesn't seem possible that there is a desire to not have football from the Argonauts. Now, maybe there is a split between football operations and ownership. And ownership is talking to people who are leaking what ownership are saying, and football ops are moving forward with the belief that the season will happen. That may be the case, that there is a bifurcation between those two worlds, but that seems hard to believe as well, that they would be given the okay to go sign these guys, to go bring in free agents, to be the most active team, to turn over the roster completely with the hope of not playing. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. You look at Montreal. Yeah, I could see the argument. The Alouettes have done very little to suggest that they are excited about having an upcoming season. But I don't know how they respond to that. I know that there wasn't much pushback on it from the West. I think the West is quite ready to believe MLSE is looking to destroy the CFL. But I don't see how you could. How do you point to every move the Argos have made in this offseason and suggest that they are not interested in having football? It would be such an incredible split of organizational priorities that I just can't believe that football ops is not on the same page as ownership.
I don't doubt the reporters that are reporting these stories. It's not them that I think it's not them where the breakdown is occurring, in my belief.
No, I mean, they're clearly getting information from real sources. So I guess that's what doesn't make any sense to me, is clearly people in a position of knowledge are leaking that Montreal and Toronto are trying to cancel the season.
I wonder if some of this might come from one of three possibilities, because like I said, I believe Justin Dunk and other reporters like that. I think that they're not making this up. They hear from their sources. Their sources are credible people. But I think these sources, the credible sources, are going one of three possible ways on this. Maybe they're interpreting something that could be, interest in running the league in a different way, or changing the league's marketing policies, or the organization of league revenue in a different way, or even engaging in XFL talks in a different way. Maybe these sources are looking at MLSE's involvement in stuff like that and deriving from it that the Argos don't want to play, when in fact that's not the case. And I'm not ruling out the possibility that these are rumors that are made up of Toronto hatred and jealousy and this anti-Toronto sentiment that exists in so many places across the country, not just in terms of the Argonauts, but in a lot of other ways too. And so, yeah, whether it's Toronto hate, jealousy, or misinterpreting information, I think that's where the breakdown is. And then these sources are going to reporters with this quote unquote information, and it's being reported, and that's why we continue to hear it. But I don't see, I have not seen anything yet. And I think you said this on a previous podcast. Show me one thing that suggests, that even hints at the idea that the Argonauts are not interested in playing in 2021. And there's nothing. You can't find a thing that would suggest that.
I just cannot believe that they don't want to have a season.
And that's what I would like to get to the bottom of. And that's where I want to redirect the story. Why are these other sources saying this stuff? What's the motivation for them? And if there's any doubt, and if you haven't been following along over the last 2 years of off season that we're hopefully almost at the end of, let's review the things that the Toronto Argonauts have done. And you tell me if this sounds like an organization that isn't interested in playing. So first of all, last year, they signed a ton of new players. And then coming into this year, they released 34 of them, only to replace them with better guys. If you have no intent of playing this year, you don't bother changing over your roster to that degree. You don't release 34 players you just signed and sign almost 40 new players. And I'm talking specifically about Americans here who have not even played a down in the CFL. You've gone out of your way to scout these guys, to find these guys from all over the place and bring them in to replace the guys that you spent last year finding and bringing in. This is a lot of work if it's just simply a ruse. And they're not random guys. These are guys that are fairly high profile. If we look at some of these signings, we've got 14 guys that are former NFL draft picks that were signed in this past year. You've got like Richard Clay, 6th round from Houston, Travis Feeney, 6th round Pittsburgh, Mike Tyson, 6th round Seattle, Jeremy Davis, 6th round the Giants, Tristan Deku, Houston, 5th round, James Sample, Kenneth Dixon, Martavis Bryant. Those guys are all 4th rounders. Eli Harold's a 3rd rounder from San Francisco. Kyrie Thornton, 3rd rounder from Green Bay. Coney Ely, Bishop Sankey, Shane Ray, a 1st rounder from Denver. Kendall Wright, a 1st rounder out of Tennessee. 14 former NFL draft picks that you've gone and brought in. There's just no chance that you do that if your end game is to not have a season. There's no motivation that I can think of that results in you bringing in all of this talent if you don't want to play.
I agree. I don't know what I'm left with. I guess we'll wait to see if they get some more information.
The other thing that I can point to as more signs that Toronto wants to have a season is anytime there has been perceived to be a hole in the roster, they've immediately gone out and fixed it. Something, again, you wouldn't care about if this was just posturing. So they saw that they had a hole at linebacker. Well, they brought in the 2 best Canadian linebackers in the league. They saw they had a hole on the offensive line. Well, they signed offensive linemen and made it a priority to draft the only game-ready guard center in the entire draft in Peter Nicastro and brought him in. They felt like there was a hole at backup quarterback, and here we are. It's McLeod, Bethel-Thompson. Every time they have thought about it and maybe said internally, you know what, I think we could still improve at this spot, they went and found the best guy that allowed them to do that. As much as, and I know we're not on the same page with McLeod, Bethel-Thompson, but was there really a better backup quarterback they could have brought in? You know, and look at the linebackers. Were there 2 better linebackers they could have brought in? Was there a better guard center prospect they could have drafted? There isn't. The answer is no. Every time that they went to address a need, they brought in the absolute best candidate to address that need. And that sounds nothing like a team that has no interest in playing. So we add that to the fact that, like Mike Hogan said on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, people just didn't lose their jobs with the Argonauts. He's still employed. He talked about that. He's like, look, I still have a job. And, it's been a couple of years now with no football, and he's still employed. There's only, I believe he said there were only a couple of people who had lost their jobs, and that was related to, I believe, temporary positions in ticket sales. But everybody else had retained their position with the Argonauts. And if this is about saving money and about trying to finagle your way into not having a season, it just doesn't add up. So at the end of the day, this McLeod Bethel-Thompson signing only strengthens that argument. And when you add it to everything else that has been done every step of the way, to me, there's no doubt that the Toronto Argonauts want to have a season. And so, like I said, I want to turn the question around and say, what is wrong with everyone else that is suggesting that the Toronto Argonauts don't want to play? These people in upper management, these people that work with other organizations, what is your real motivation? What is at the root of you saying that the Toronto Argonauts don't want to have a season? That's what I would like to hear.
My hope is that at some point there will be a formal ownership vote on whether to continue the season, and that the results of that vote will be made public. I guess that's where I come down on it.
Perhaps the single greatest point that I can make throughout the course of this entire episode is the fact that when we look at all the things I've illustrated, the players that they've brought in, even the coaches they've signed, like Joshua Bell, an up-and-coming coach with a terrific future ahead of him, a guy that will one day be a head coach in the CFL. Guys like that, guys like the first round, second round, third round draft picks that they've brought in from the NFL, guys out of small schools like Bethune-Cookman, Wagner, Stevens Point, that are looking for what might be their shot. There's no chance that Argos management is talking to their agents, talking to them, making promises when in actual fact, there's no intent on playing. There's just no way that's happening, especially not from a guy like Michael Clemens. There's no way he's telling them one thing and believing something else. There is no world in which I would believe that. And so at the end of the day, regardless of what else you might think, we've illustrated there's no proof of any sort, not even a thread, that would suggest that the Argos don't want to play in 2021. And if you look at the characters involved, the people involved, there's just no way that there's this deception going on, because it would be catastrophic for the organization going forward. If these were lies that were being told, and agents of these guys that are trying to get back into the NFL, or guys that are just coming out of college, 23, 24 years old, and looking for their big break, their one shot, and they've decided to sign with the Toronto Argonauts, if it came out that the Argonauts didn't want to play, they'd be ruined. Their credibility would be shot. And these are people that are football lifers that not only have been in it for a long time, but intend to be in it for a long time to come. And they're just not going to put that out there. They're not going to risk that. So in my mind, there's absolutely no way, no world in which any of this could be true. Well, that will just about do it for us on this week's episode of the X's and Argos podcast. If you've got time, I would love it if you rated, subscribed, told all your friends about us. It'll help other Argonaut fans find out where we are as we get closer and closer to the 2021 season. For JB, my name's Ben Grant saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see ya.
Go, Toronto Argos, go, go, go. Pull together, fight the fight.